So Kate Nation is a professor in the Department of Experimental Psychology, and she's also the director of the Read Oxford Research Group, which is a fantastic blog as well. So check it out, Read Oxford blog. Professor Nation completed her first degree in psychology at the University of York. She stayed at York to complete her PhD on spelling development, supervised by Charles Hume. She then completed her postdoctoral work with Maggie Snowling on reading and language in children with poor reading comprehension, a topic that has kept her busy for the last 20 years. She moved to Oxford to take up her current post in 2002. Her research focuses on a range of questions concerning the nature of reading and its development, from how children begin to recognize words, through to how meaning is extracted and constructed as people read. Alongside her basic research, she is committed to building links between psychological research and educational policy and practice. Join me in welcoming Professor Kate Nation.
Okay, thank you very much. Is the microphone on? Can people hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, Tiffany. It's absolutely lovely to be here. I actually feel quite close to home. My first badge that I received this morning says Oxford MA, which first of all, I thought they've given me a Master of Arts, which I don't have, and then I realised it was Oxford, Massachusetts, as opposed to the other place. Now, I'm sure many folks in this room know that it's Dyslexia Awareness Month this month. If you don't, it is. We've got another week or so to go. If you're not following Nadine Gabb on Twitter, do so. And she's been putting out the most amazing tweets every day this month, trying to capture the science of reading, the science of dyslexia, implications for practice, and also trying to dispel some of the myths that are out there that we have to battle with, all of us, lurking around dyslexia. So definitely check that out. I actually want to start, though, by a call out to developmental language disorder. It might be Dyslexia Month, but it's actually today Developmental Language Disorder Awareness Day, International Day. Now, I don't know how many of you heard of DLD or work with kids with DLD. DLD? Okay, so it's, let me say, a substantial minority of people raised their hands there. Now, DLD, it's a label that's given for children who have difficulty acquiring their native language for no obvious reason. These children are not rare. Epidemiological studies tell us that 2 children in every classroom have clinically significant levels of developmental language disorder, severe enough to hamper academic process, socio-emotional well-being, self-regulation, and of course, literacy, reading, writing, and other aspects of academic achievement. Because people aren't aware of them, both in the scientific community, there's not much funding that goes to DLD research, but also out there in clinical and educational practice, Dorothy Bishop and others started an awareness campaign a few years ago, which is up at the top there, RADLD, Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder. So check that out. Check out DLD and Me, which is an American-focused group trying to support and raise awareness of DLD. And Tiffany's podcast, which is a fantastic listen, and again has been pumping out the episodes this last week to try and hit DLD Awareness Day, which is today. Part of the celebrations for the Awareness Day is all centred around the colours purple and yellow. So I was very pleased to see, they've moved seats. Oh, no, you've just got a cardigan on. I saw a lady earlier when I was walking in wearing a purple dress with a yellow belt, and I was like, yep. And it's lovely to see some people in purple and yellow. We were out last night at the bridge here in Boston, which was lit up in purple and yellow. And all around the world, there's scenes going on here. I'm not quite sure where that beautiful sun scene is from, but here we've got Melbourne, we've got Brisbane, we've got London. I don't know where DCU is. We've got cakes. Everybody trying to raise awareness of DLD. That's all I'm going to say about DLD for the time being, but it's actually relevant to the theme of the talk that's going to develop as I go on. So we will come back to DLD beyond purple and yellow. But let me start with an overview of what I'd like to talk about for the next 50 minutes or so. I want to start by thinking about reading. What is it? What is reading? What do we do when we read? And what is it we want our children to achieve? And then with that as a backdrop, we can think about why some children struggle to read. What is dyslexia? And this will take us through a little overview of some of the cognitive theories of dyslexia about what might be going on. Not so much at the brain level as in Ken's talk, although of course it's happening in the brain, but thinking more about the cognitive processes that might be different in people that we might describe as having dyslexia. And this sets up some implications for intervention and for teaching, which I'm not going to dwell on in today's talk, but just trying to make some links out there. And then try and wrap things up. But in between that, think about the overlap between dyslexia and DLD. So let's start with reading. As Ken reminded us, reading is a biologically secondary skill. We're not born to read. We've evolved to speak, to listen, to communicate, but not through written language. Written language is a hard-won thing that we have to learn, that we have to struggle with, and then we have this amazing talent. And what an amazing talent it is. I think those of us who are fluent at reading just forget the enormity of what we do when we process words. I love this quote from the novelist Ian McEwan, who's a very neuroscientific novelist. Ken, I don't know if you like his novels, but he wrote in Atonement, reading is a form of telepathy. By means of ink and symbols onto a page, you are able to send your thoughts and feelings from your mind to the readers. It's a magical process, so commonplace that no one stops to wonder at it. Reading a sentence and understanding it are the same thing. There's no gap in which the symbols are unravelled. You see the word castle, and it's there. And I love this because it really conjures the spirit of what we feel when we read. It's just so effortless, it happens. But of course, the children we see in our classrooms, our clinics, our research studies, this doesn't follow. Extraordinary thing about reading is how good we are at it once we're a skilled reader. So this effect, anybody who studies psychology will know this effect, the Stroop effect. And it's one of those experiments that you can guarantee is going to work. If you're doing a public engagement event and you want to do a little experiment, this is the one to do. For those of you who don't know it, the task is really simple. It couldn't be simpler. All the participant has to do is to name the colour of the ink. So here it would be red, green, blue, green, yellow. So unless somebody has colour blindness issues, this is absolutely a trivial task. Let's change it a little bit. In this condition, the participants still have to name the colour ink. So it would be green, blue, red, blue. Straightforward and easy. Same task again. This time, again, we name the colour of the ink. Blue, red, yellow, green, blue. It's really, really, really hard. I think, if you have a go at it mentally, it's really obvious how hard it is for us to do this. And this tells us something important. This tells us once we're fluent, once we have automatic word recognition, it happens even when we don't want it to happen. When it gets in the way, it happens. Right? In the journey of learning to read, we have to develop a system that's flexible to deal with quite a lot of different types of stimuli that the written language throws at us. So, other than the people with dyslexia in the room, for most of us, it's easy to read words like perplistalonk, she says, perplistalonk, and staticultify. Yeah, you've never seen those words before, okay? But we can read them. They're nonsense words. We have nonsense words here, but these nonsense words are a little bit different if you know Harry Potter. But the English language, all languages, have something in them that trips us up. In English, we've got there, and there, to, and to, sail and sail, words that look different but sound the same. And then we've got wind and wind, and read and read, words that look the same but sound different, mean different things. Break and stake, but we've got bleak and streak. I'll be going back to Oxford next week to teach my undergraduate lecture in learning to read for the first-year undergrads. And they've only been in town for a week or so, and they're still tripped up by Magdalen Choir as opposed to Magdalen Choir. We have the River Thames running through Oxford down into London, but the town on the river a bit further downstream is Tame. So we have Thames and Tame. So many examples, you'll all know and love the examples, that make English a challenging orthography to learn to read. But when we can do it, we do it at an amazing rate. So a recent meta-analysis by Mark Brisbart demonstrates that as we read silently for meaning, at a rate about 238 words a minute. It's immense. It's faster than some of us speak. And we're also doing such a lot of processing as we go along. And I love this example. It really captures quite a lot about reading, I think. So the sentence, Sandra lied to Elaine during the trial because she was gullible. This seems really pretty straightforward to understand, as long as we know what all the words mean, right? It's actually an ambiguous sentence, and somewhere in our cognitive apparatus, in our language system, there's a bit of work going on. Because the pronoun she could refer to either Sandra or Elaine. Both of those are legal syntactic constructions. We don't even notice that, because I think most of us would put the she to Elaine, and Sandra does the lying because Elaine is gullible, right? Everybody got that? Let's just change one word. Sandra lied to Elaine during the trial because she was scared. Exactly the same sentence until the final word, which occurs after the pronoun she, and yet I think it changes where most of us assign the pronoun to, and most of us now would say she refers to Sandra, and Sandra did the lying because she was scared. It doesn't have to be that way. It might still be Elaine that's scared, but most of the time, most of us would read it in the Sandra form. So we're reading these words, we're identifying these words, and we're constructing meaning very rapidly without even realizing that we're doing it as skilled readers. That's skilled readers. Let's take it down to what kids have to learn when they're 4, 5, 6 years of age and first start learning. So here's a really simple little piece of text. Really simple, 2 sentences, pretty straightforward words, but yet, again, we've got lots of complexity here. Denise was stuck in a jam. She was worried what her boss would say. Now, clearly the first thing that has to happen is the child has to be able to identify the words, to, some people say, lift the words off the page, to construct a linguistic representation of those visual symbols. Otherwise, reading just stops at that point. So we have to be able to identify the words. Absolutely necessary, but absolutely not sufficient, right? Need to activate the contextually appropriate meaning. So, stuck in a jam, like some of us were this morning, it's a traffic jam. It's unlikely to be the fruit conserve that you put on your toast in the morning. Have to make the causal connections. So again, we've got the she and the pronouns and the hers going on here. We need to make inferences. Some of those are specific and actually embodied in the text. Others are linked to our sort of mental model of what might be going on, about what we think about her boss, whether she's always late for work, whether she's really dependent on the salary and her losing a job would be terrible. We can make all sorts of inferences that go beyond the text. And that, of course, requires us to know something about the characters and the situation. We need all this background knowledge, this sort of cultural literacy. So reading comprehension, then, is the active construction of meaning across all of these different domains. It's forming a mental representation of the text and the situation that is described by that text. Now, much of what's in this picture here is common to spoken language. As Ken said, we think about reading as being parasitic upon speech and language. That came first. Evolutionary, it comes first developmentally. And, of course, the thing that's really special about reading is the red blob. Identifying the words. We have to identify words in speech and language, but we do it via ear. In written language, we do it by eye, and this requires this appreciation of the written symbols and how they code for spoken language. So this sort of takes us to the simple view of reading. How familiar are people with a simple view? Okay, so relatively just fewer than half, I'd say. So the simple view of reading is a way of describing, it doesn't really explain, but it describes the reading system by making a separation between that red blob and all the green things that I showed you, right? So the red blob is to do with what's described in this picture as decoding, being able to recognize, to identify, to speak aloud, perhaps, the visual symbols. Clearly, that's essential to reading comprehension. Comprehension can't happen if you can't identify the words at a reasonable rate of accuracy and indeed fluency. All the other stuff that's shared with spoken comprehension, the inferences, the background knowledge, the causal connections, the activating contextually appropriate meanings, all belongs to what's described in the simple view as linguistic comprehension. That's also critical, okay? If you don't have linguistic comprehension, you might be able to identify the words, but you can't put them together to form a message, okay? It's like me reading Spanish, I might be able to read it in a decoding sense, but I don't comprehend it because I have no linguistic comprehension of Spanish, unless it's a menu food. Okay. So a little bit about reading then, and to think about how we can sort of carve up the multidimensional space around the complexity of reading by putting it into these two interacting but nevertheless separable domains, one to do with identifying the visual words and the other to do with putting them together to make a message. Both are necessary, neither are sufficient on their own. So what is dyslexia then? Well, we could spend many a long hour talking about answers to this question, but dyslexia, of course, is an unexpected difficulty with learning to read and to spell words, despite all the obvious explanations for those difficulties being excluded. Lots of discussion around what is and what isn't dyslexia, but I'm just going to stick with this definition that it's a difficulty with learning to read and spell. That's its core. There we are. Sorry, I'm a slide ahead here. So we can think about dyslexia as a thing, and it's a difficulty with learning to read words. I think many of us, and the evidence base suggests it's at the bottom end of a normal distribution as opposed to being some discrete thing out there, as we might think when we see it in a circle like this. Now, dyslexia, when we see it in a circle like this, looks very specific, it looks very defined and precise. Of course, those of us who work with dyslexic kids in our studies or in our classrooms know that we rarely see something that fits that thing. You know, these children are complex. You know, they live in complex communities, in families that might have other stuff going on at a sort of societal level. But also within the child themselves, we often see co-occurring difficulties with language, with motor control, with arithmetic and mathematics, with concentration, with personal organisation, and so on and so on. These themselves are not usually considered to be causal influences on dyslexia, although we'll come back to this a little bit later on, but they're co-occurrences of things that go alongside it. And this takes us very quickly to a sort of multiple risk framework model of thinking about causation in dyslexia. So if we take a medical example like, I can't think of one, lung cancer. Okay, so we know a risk factor for lung cancer is smoking, but it's probabilistic, right? It happens in combination with other things. There are people who get lung cancer who've never smoked. There are people who smoke 60 a day, don't get lung cancer. But we know the probability of having lung cancer if you smoke is probably greater if you have family risk, if you're a smoker, all these other risk factors that add in. And so would be it with neurodevelopmental disorders like dyslexia. We know they have a heritable basis influenced by multiple genes acting in complex ways on neurodevelopment. But they bring about this common phenotype, an expression of a genotype, which is a difficulty with reading and spelling. And there's much evidence, I think Ken alluded to some of this in his talk, that the phenotype of dyslexia is associated with these underlying difficulties in phonological processing. So being able to play around with the sound structure of language. Nothing to do with meaning here, but just being able to hear out the sounds of words, play around with them, and do this sort of metalinguistic stuff on speech, components of speech. So at a proximal level, then, we can think about dyslexia being a manifestation of this underlying difference in the way that some people process speech, and particularly the sound structure of speech. So let's take this back to, oh, whoops, that tick's not meant to be there yet. Let's take this back to the simple model, the simple view. So the simple view is up there. Imagine we go out and we test 1,000 children and young people, and we measure their decoding and we measure their linguistic comprehension. And then we can plot where each child falls on those two measures in this sort of area of multidimensional space, whether they're poor at decoding over there on the left or good at decoding, and on the vertical axis we've got comprehension. Now, for the classic dyslexic child that's described in our textbooks, yet we don't that often see in our studies, you know, classically they'd have a difficulty with decoding, everything else would be fine, and they'd sit very comfortably in quadrant A of the multidimensional space. Right? So that's the classic view of dyslexia. We're going to come back and challenge that a little bit later in the talk, but for the time being, let's stick with the classic view. And then we can think about, okay, these kids have difficulties with word recognition and with decoding words, And that's probably due to these underlying differences in phonological processing, which in themselves are due to differences in neurodevelopment, which has a heritable basis, in interaction with all the environmental stuff going on as well. So this is the classic view that's out there in the literature. So let's just summarize that and some premises that fall from it. So people with dyslexia find decoding difficult. Anybody struggling with the term decoding, just think of it like non-word reading, like reading static autofy. Okay? Poor decoding, this difficulty with getting from the visual symbols to a linguistic representation, is the bottleneck for a lot of the difficulties that people with dyslexia face. So the difficulties with reading comprehension might be a consequence of the difficulties of getting the words off the page. Those stem from underlying difficulties with phonological processing. So what falls from this then, if we fix the decoding and the underlying issues that are causing the decoding problems, word reading should follow, and from that, reading comprehension should follow. We get this nice causal chain from phonological problems to decoding and word problems to comprehension problems. Now, I think this set of premises works, but I also think it's an oversimplification, and it doesn't really reflect what we see when we have complexity and when we have mess in our research studies or in our classrooms. So I want to challenge some of these while not wiping them off the page completely. I think something we need to do if we want to make progress, and this is both scientific progress, but also progress that makes it relevant for the classroom by thinking which aspects of the reading process should our interventions target to optimize learning. We need to unpack what's meant by decoding. So in the simple view, we just think of it as a sort of thing, as if it's a thing in its own right. But it isn't really. I mean, what is decoding? Does it just refer to non-word reading, like being able to read perplisteronk, a word you've never seen before? Or does it refer to something that's more like what we see in the Stroop effect I showed you earlier, this accurate and automatic word recognition? Decoding in the simple view, it really is a construct. It's what a statistician would call a latent variable. It's like a gathering, a club of word reading measures. It's not a particular process in itself, and this becomes important, I think, when we think about intervention in a little while. So to move beyond the simple view and this conglomerate of decoding, I think we need to think a little bit more about the processes that are involved in reading itself. And to help us with this, I'm going to refer to the triangle model that Ken so helpfully, thank you, set up for me in his talk. And this stems from the work of Mark Seidenberg, David Plout, and colleagues. So the idea is that the language system has these things in them called semantic representations and phonology representations. So semantics to do with the meaning of words, the stuff that we know, and phonology is to do with the sounds of the language, the speech sounds. And then orthography, of course, is what reading brings to the table, this new form of representation that has to get hooked into the reading system. And we can think about different types of mappings within this framework. There's the representations themselves, but also there's the connections and the mappings between them. So first of all, let's think about the mappings between phonology and semantics. Now, clearly, children have these way before reading is ever a thing, okay? Young children, they can identify, this is a cup. So cup is the phonology. This thing here is the semantics, the cup. And that's a mapping between those two things, a referential mapping. Now, these are arbitrary in the sense that the meaning of cup and the sound of cup are not systematically related to each other. So cup and cat sound very similar, but the semantic representations of cup and cat are a mile apart. Okay, it's not systematic, it's somewhat arbitrary, at least for monomorphemic words. Okay, so children have those for free when they come to the task of learning to read. When they learn to read, they're then faced with having to bolt on orthography, writing onto this language system. So they have to develop these mappings between orthography and phonology. These are systematic. Despite the funny examples I showed earlier, of course the English language is defined by regularity and consistency, or maybe pseudo-regularity and consistency. So a spelling is somewhat predictable from its sound. So cat and cap sound the same, even though they mean completely different things. Okay? So you imagine the orthography to phonology mappings are really stressed when we first come across a word like Quidditch. Okay? Then we also have mappings between orthography and semantics. And we know these have to be here because we can read the words sail and sail without any other context around them. And even though they sound the same, they point to different meanings. So there must be something between the sounds of the word, the spelling of the word and the meaning of the word that is happening in skilled readers. Otherwise, sail and sail, we wouldn't know which one it is, whereas it's obviously straightforward for us to do that. We know from lots and lots of psycholinguistic work and lots of computational modelling work that we can think about reading with these two different pathways and this sort of division of labour type idea that Ken alluded to. We can think of words being read from orthography to phonology to semantics. So we have the orthography, we sort of sound it out, turn it into speech, and then that speech activates meaning. But we can also do this direct mapping, something more like sight word reading, I guess, from orthography to semantics directly. And skilled readers do both of these things at the same time. It's all going on in a very interactive processing system. Most skilled readers rely more on the blue pathway because it's faster. Okay? We don't need to go via overt phonology. But that doesn't mean to say that that's what children do or what beginning readers do or how we should teach reading. Okay, so I want to try and explain why going the red way is the way to develop the blue way. Okay? And that's because we know the pathway to learning to read in an alphabetic system like English is paved by sound, these connections between orthography, phonology to meaning. Okay? So the alphabetic principle then, I'm sure many of you have come across that term before, is this fundamental insight that children have to have that oh, wow, these letters, they're not just squiggles on a page. These letters relate to speech in a systematic way. The 26 letters of the alphabet work for us to recreate speech. And they do this in very clever and interesting and sometimes annoying ways. And it's not easy for us to do this when we're first learning. First of all, speech sounds themselves are very ambiguous. So if you just say to yourself the words spit and pit, the p sounds very, very different. Acoustically, it has very different parameters. And that's true regardless of whether you're reading or just a listening. It's just a feature of speech that it's a very ambiguous stimulus. So that's hard. It's hard to hear speech sounds. Okay? And then, of course, the mappings are not consistent, as we've already alluded to. So here, as I've said before, same sound, different spellings. We've got the same spelling, different sounds. We've got things that look similar, sound similar, but have distinct meanings and so on. And English is a particular challenge here. This is a map of Europe that I can still show while the UK is still there. So what it's showing here is the percentage of words read correctly by, I think, end of first grade by European country. So the UK there is down at 41%. We're really bad. This is a few years ago. I suspect we'd be better now because we've had a change in the way teaching happens. But we can see compared with Spain, compared with France, compared with Italy, we're doing less well. The Danes give us a bit of a run for the money, and the Portuguese are a bit dodgy as well. And what unites the English, Portuguese, and Danish is that we have a lot of irregularity in the mappings, okay, unlike Spanish and Italian. So it's just harder, okay? And I guess in the US, there's no reason to think it wouldn't be. It's English, same thing. So struggle for your kids, struggle for our kids. So we know that initial reading is from O to P to S, from orthography to phonology to semantics. It has to happen that way because kids have to learn how these things relate together. And we know, again, from a large database of high-quality research, that this learning route is promoted by high-quality, systematic and explicit instruction around a phonics-type theme. Kids have to learn this alphabetic knowledge. It's not all there is to reading, but they have to learn it. And evidence suggests that the best way to learn it is to teach it directly, which takes us to systematic phonics instruction. Get the system going with some phonics instruction and learning about the alphabetic principle and developing these links between orthography and phonology. And then for many children, although of course not for the children we're focusing on today, the dyslexic kids, everything else just sort of seems to follow with reading experience. And reading experience obviously is really, really important. because what reading experience does is it exposes us to all of those regularities and sub-regularities and all that complexity that's in the written language. And by exposing ourselves to it and trying to deal with it, we begin to internalize those systematic probabilities, those cues that are there in the system, but we just need to discover them. And we discover them just by being exposed to them and reading a lot, okay? And then we begin to internalize these sub-regularities. But it's not obviously so simple in dyslexia, otherwise there wouldn't be such a thing as dyslexia. And if we think about dyslexia, we can go back to the triangle model and think, well, where is this, where does dyslexia come from within this framework? And here the idea would be that dyslexic children, for whatever reason, some neurobiological risk, come to the task of learning to read with whatever's in this phonology bubble, not in such good shape relative to their peers. And therefore, when they begin to try and make these mappings between orthography and phonology, they struggle, because what they're trying to map to, the phonology, is wobbly. It's not given a secure foundation, so making mappings is harder to do. So underlying phonological deficits compromise the development of this O to P pathway. And I think, there's no better place to see this in cases of classic dyslexia than to look at spelling. Okay, anybody who works with kids, you can see this time and time and time again in their writing. So this is an example of a passage written by J.M., who was a little boy studied longitudinally by Maggie Snowling and Charles Hume. And I'll just read a little bit of this because I don't think you'd get it without hearing the gloss. So London is the capital of England, and in the streets there's lots of black taxis and large buildings. The Queen lives in London and the streets are crammed with people. Lots of trains come in and out of London. Harrods is in London and it's very expensive. And I think London is a noisy place, and if I lived in London I would go mad with all the people and the buzzing, but it has a lot of beautiful possessions. Okay. Clearly a very, very, very severe case of dyslexia, arguably some other stuff going on as well. But here I think we can see that phonological problem, that difficulty with representing speech by letters it's just rampant there. Okay, so that's a little bit about O to P and then hopefully to S from there. But as I've said, this is necessary but not sufficient. Kids need to go beyond the alphabetic principle, and we need to teach them and help them make that jump. Partly this is reading experience, because that allows us to internalize these probabilistic relationships. But we also need to think about these O to S mappings, these orthographic to semantic type mappings. Where do they come from? How does the system deal with that? We can't possibly learn each individual word by rote. That can't possibly happen. So there's two things I just want to flag here. One is about a concept that's called orthographic learning, and the other is about thinking about morphology in the language. So let me start, first of all, on orthographic learning. So orthographic learning has been defined as something like, in fact, I think this is a direct quote, the processes or knowledge required to move from an alphabetic decoding type strategy to something that resembles what we do, what skilled readers do. I like this term because it allows us to think about learning to read not as sort of discrete stages, but more as just a continuous progression with experience. So children, they move from novice to expert via orthographic learning. And also for all of us, new words enter our language all the time. Dumbledore and Quidditch. Initially, they're read by alphabetic decoding, but not for us any longer. That we know those words, they've become familiar. So it isn't just about children, it's also about individual items as they move from a novel word that we've never seen before to something that actually is highly familiar and we can recognize it accurately and fluently. Thinking about the concept of orthographic learning takes us naturally to the work of David Sher. This is, I think, is really, really nice work that stood the test of time and produced some really nice experimental findings. And he describes the task of learning to read, of orthographic learning, as being a self-teaching phenomena. So it's not like there's a teacher that's teaching every single word. The teacher gets the system going, arguably by something that looks like phonics instruction, and that and reading experience all tumbles together to bring about orthographic learning, and skilled word reading pops out at the end. And what Cher says is that decoding, this O to P to S type thing I've been talking about, the red pathway, is really critical to this. Okay, it's not the end goal, but it's the way to get to the end goal. Because decoding provides children with the opportunity to translate the letters into the sounds, to get from the written symbol to a spoken representation. To do this, we know that these phonological skills in the spoken domain are really important and fundamental. But let's think about the product of doing this. The child's painfully sounded out a word for the first time. What does that buy them? What do they get from it? Well, they get two things. First of all, they've seen that word, Quidditch, let's keep with that example. They've seen it, and next time they see it, it'll be familiar, a little bit more familiar. It won't be quite so novel anymore. It'll have a frequency of 1, a frequency of 2, a frequency of 3 with each encounter. So something word-specific about seeing that word. Also, though, it does something else, and this is a little bit more implicit and a little bit more gradual, but it allows children to experience words, and from that very experience, they get more data into their database of how the written language works. So with Quidditch, what do you get? You get QU at the beginning of a word. Okay? That's not item specific, that is seen in other words. You get the CH at the end, that's seen in other words. You get the syllabic pattern, that's seen in other words. All that can all get absorbed at the same time as learning something about the word-specific Quidditch. We know orthographic learning happens because we can see it in real life and in some quite fun experiments. So this is one set of experiments that I've been involved in. So this is one of Professor Parsnip's inventions. So what happens in this experiment is that the children read a little story about an invention. So this is always the children's favourite invention. A Yate is used to take out the food that you don't like on your plate. It has a tube and 2 open ends. So this happens, and Anne Castles, my friend and collaborator, tells the story about how children sometimes ask where they can buy one of these because they like the idea of it, okay? So this is the exposure phase. The children, they just read in silently, read into themselves, and they experience this new word. No emphasis is given to it, no attention is given by the teacher or the assessor. And then later on, there's a test phase. It might be the next day, a week later, a month later. Which is a word, Yate or Yate? If children have learnt Yate from the Professor Parsnip's story, they should be above chance at choosing the correct spelling. And they're doing this by something that's like orthography to semantics, because if you were doing it via P, you'd be at chance, because both of them are Yate. You need the orthography to get to the right answer, okay? Or we can ask children to spell the word Yate. Remember that invention, Yate? Write it down for me. Do they spell it the way they saw it, or do they spell it the way it sounds? Okay. And by doing this sort of experiment, we can begin to try and understand a little bit more about the parameters of orthographic learning and what matters. One thing that really matters, and I'll say this again, is phonological decoding, this ability to do the translation to sound. And again, it's not the strategy as such that, it's the thing that has to happen for the end goal to happen. The end goal is being able to spell Yate and recognise Yate with the correct spelling, but to get there, it goes through the code. And this gives us the word-specific information. We've learnt something about Yate, and we've also learnt something about how A is spelled with an A and a magic E, or whatever it's called at the end. Something specific, something that's generalisable. But we also know other things must contribute to orthographic learning as well. Okay? We know it's not all down to phonological decoding. There's other things, but I think the science hasn't done a particularly conclusive job of working out what else is going on. It's a little bit of a black box at the moment that many of us are trying to understand more about. There's other things that are important for orthographic learning in addition to phonological decoding, but phonological decoding is absolutely important. So let's think about orthographic learning and dyslexia. And again, I think this is a bit of a struggle for the literature and the evidence base, because there's a few paradoxes out there. So one, I'm always troubled. Well, I'm just going to share two, and I'm troubled by both of them. How are some dyslexic children able to build up orthographic knowledge despite poor decoding? If poor decoding was the way into orthographic learning, for children like dyslexic kids who go on having decoding problems for a long, long, long time, how do they begin to make progress in reading? Okay, and of course, our children do make progress, pleasingly. We know they don't make progress in decoding because of the non-word reading difficulty that persists across the lifespan, arguably. So these are some very old data to illustrate this point from Maggie Snowling and colleagues. And what's plotted here is the percentage of non-words, words like perplisterong, that the children are able to read correctly by reading age. So we've got kids who are reading at the 7-year-old level, word reading, at the 7-year-old level, the 8-year-old level, the 9-year-old level, 10-year-old level. The red line, which is some typically developing kids, and as you can imagine, as reading age goes up, so does their non-word reading ability. Okay, these things correlate together. And if you've got a reading age of 10, you can read more non-words than children who've got a reading age of 7. But the dyslexic kids look pretty different here. So for the same reading age, the children are proportionately worse at reading nonsense words than they are at reading words. Okay, at the 7-year-old level, and particularly there at the 10-year-old level, they still have this difficulty with phonological decoding, the gateway into word reading, but yet their word reading is going up. So something else is clearly going on. There's something that they can capitalize on that helps them learn to read despite these persistent difficulties with reading nonsense. That's pleasing, but we need to know what that is so that we can optimize it in reading instruction. Okay? So that's one paradox, and I think the research literature, there's a few cues and a few pointers out there, but there's a lot of question marks and a lot of unknowns and a lot of studies that need to be done. Another paradox in the dyslexia world is that some children with word reading difficulties, sometimes referred to as having a surface dyslexia type profile, the self-teaching hypothesis doesn't work very well there at all, because these are kids who have difficulties with reading words but don't seem to have ever had this classic non-word reading difficulty that characterizes the majority of kids with dyslexia. Okay? Some people have argued these kids don't exist, but there's some pretty convincing examples out there in the literature, although I would argue that they're quite rare, and they're certainly not the kids that we see most commonly. These kids, they can decode, but they're not building an adequate orthographic representation because they have big difficulties with word reading. They find the 8-8 task really challenging. Okay. So what's going on there? The pointers in the literature that folk are working on at the moment, people are thinking about paired associate learning ability or the ability to embody these regularizations, this sort of statistical learning type description. But the bottom line is that there's more to learning to read words than the links between orthography and phonology and phonological decoding. That's not to say that that's not absolutely critical, but there's more to it than that. And the orthographic learning literature tells us that, although it doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. So let's go back to the triangle model and think about another type of regularity that's there in the written language system that I've not talked about yet. And this is these connections between spelling and morphology. So morphology refers to the sort of meaning units of representation. We can think about phonemes referring to bits of sound of language. Morpheme refers to bits of meaning of language. So, for example, book, bookworm, and bookish. If we know book, that helps us know a little bit about bookworm and bookish. Okay? If we know kindness, that tells us a little bit about unkind and kindly. And knowing kind also tells us about kindness, which in turn tells us a little bit about shyness and darkness. There's regularities here. These aren't regularities necessarily of sound, although sometimes it co-occurs with sound. These are systematic regularities between the orthography and the meaning that that orthography denotes, these spelling morphology links. And these are our language. The English language is in linguistic terms, it's morphophonemic. It's riddled with morphological regularity. It's there. We embody it. We know it because we can spell correctly. Okay? So take this example here, herded, kicked, and snored. We spell those with ED in their past tense. We don't spell them with a D, a T, or a D, as in herded, kicked, and snored. That's an example of us being sensitive to these morphological regularities and using them in our spelling. And there's some really lovely work. I mean, I think we might hear a bit more about this afternoon in Ken and Louisa's talks, perhaps. There's lots of lovely work been going on, looking at morphology and morphological awareness and the importance of morphology. And some really lovely paper by Kathy Russell that's just recently come out that I encourage you to take a look at. Because what she describes there is just overwhelming systematicity that I think many of us we don't realize it's there at an explicit level. So, for example, the ED spelling is a highly reliable cue to past tense meaning. And in their corpus analyses, they've searched all the thousands of words there are out there in their language, and there's only 38 words that have an ED ending that are that aren't past tense. So there's words like bed and shed and moped. Everything else that's got an ED, if it's a monomorphemic word, so everything else that's got an ED, if it's not a monomorphemic word, is past tense. This is amazing systematicity, okay? Skilled readers, we are sensitive to these probabilities. That's how the spelling system works and why we spell words the way we do, with things like past tense and lots of derivational morphologies as well. These are properties of the reading system that become embodied in us as we read and experience print. We soak them up. So the question is, can we use these regularities as an instructional device to try and bypass some of the red pathway difficulties that we know our dyslexic kids have? So dyslexia and those spelling morphology links then, these are a potential compensatory resource. So maybe those kids who can't make progress by, continued phonics instruction, they need some direct instruction in morphology as well and making these spelling morphology links. Because, my goodness, they're there in the language. They're there. They're cues ready to be harnessed and used as a compensatory resource. But, of course, any compensatory resource has the flip side because it's also an additional risk factor. So morphology and these connections between meaning, between spelling and meaning, they don't just depend on orthography and the links to meaning. It depends on having the meaning. If you don't know what kind is, knowing that it's kindness, kindly, and kindly isn't going to get you very far. Okay, you need the meaning. So it's a potential compensatory resource to be hijacked or harnessed, but it depends on the integrity of the oral language system. And if kids have difficulties there, then they're going to struggle with the morphological aspects of instruction too. Which brings me just to finish in the final section of the talk to think about these overlaps between dyslexia and language impairment or developmental language disorder. Because I think this helps us think about compensation and additional risk in potentially quite interesting ways. So we've already had dyslexia as a little bubble on its own, and classically DLD, or which used to be referred to by various different terms, and in particular specific language impairment. Again, another bubble, different research literatures, different professional affiliations, with dyslexia being education, DLD being the business of SLPs, two different things, as if they're two different things. Yet the reality is something much, much more like this. Okay? The comorbidity or the co-occurrence between dyslexia difficulties and spoken language difficulties is enormous. Even if you have a quite strong threshold of a severity which warrants a diagnostic label, it's probably at about 50%. Would you say that's fair, Tiffany? About 50%. Okay. So if you're selecting kids who are dyslexic for your studies or you've got them in the classroom, if you measured spoken language, about 50% of them would also have something that looks a little bit like developmental language disorder, and vice versa. If you're recruiting kids who primarily have a spoken language problem, then those reading problems will be there if you measure them. So 50%, this is not a trivial number. So here's the classic model I've been working around today of developmental dyslexia in terms of the simple view of reading, a specific difficulty with decoding that's underpinned by these phonological problems. The rest of the language system is fine. Fix the decoding, everything's fine. That's not to say that those children don't exist. There are, for sure, cases of classic developmental dyslexia. The reality, though, for most kids, I would argue, is more complex. Right? I'm seeing a few nods, but certainly in my experience, it's more complex. Okay. So what does that mean for learning to read if instead of this sort of pattern, we move to that sort of pattern? So there are some kids come into the challenge of learning to read, not just with the phonological problems, but with those phonological problems in the context of broader problems with spoken language, low vocabulary, difficulties with grammar, with sentence comprehension, with understanding and producing language beyond the phonological domain. And we can think of this in terms of a profile of strengths and weaknesses, which is unique to every child. Everybody's got different levels of all of these things. These all interact together to bring about reading and reading comprehension, which is great if you've got lots of strengths because they all come together to help you. But of course, if there are weak points in the system, then the whole thing can fall apart and break down and reading doesn't progress. But by thinking about it with respect to compensation and multiple risk factors, I think there are lessons here for instruction by trying to work out what's going on with the individual child so we know where to target particular interventions. So I just want to say a little bit about reading comprehension and a little bit about spoken language and dyslexia, link it back to intervention, and then I'm done. Interestingly, I wrote a paper. It's not interesting that I wrote a paper. Interesting when I was writing this paper, I did a literature search for studies of reading comprehension. Thank you. In dyslexia, and it's actually a really small literature. I was surprised by how little work there is looking at reading comprehension itself in kids who have a label or a diagnosis of developmental dyslexia. So there's relatively little work out there. The work that's out there suggests that at a group level, reading comprehension is sort of low. It's not terrible, but it's not brilliant. But the range is enormous. So in those studies that have been done, within the population of dyslexic people in the study, there are some kids who are really struggling with reading comprehension to some who are doing reasonably well. Within this literature, there's definitely a tendency to consider poor word reading as the cause of all this. So you have difficulty with reading words, therefore, of course, you're going to have difficulty with comprehension. And of course, that's true. That makes sense, that reading comprehension problems are going to be a downstream consequence of difficulty with reading words. But let's think again about those 50% of kids who actually don't just have a phonological problem, they also have broader language problems. What does it mean for reading comprehension risk for those kids if they have difficulties not just with phonology and decoding, but with vocabulary, with grammar, with morphosyntax, and so on? And I think the evidence here is really compelling that tells us we need to sort of take this problem seriously. First of all, there's the 50% statistic. But also there's now a very consistent pattern of findings coming from family risk studies, which I think they're certainly theoretically interesting, but also important for practice. So these are large-scale studies that recruit children who are at risk of becoming dyslexic because they come from families that have dyslexia in the family. So we know dyslexia has a heritable basis. It runs in families. It certainly runs in my family, and I know there are other people here who are from dyslexic families. Or maybe dyslexic themselves. So if you recruit babies and young children from such families, as well as non-risk families, you can start studying those children's language, all sorts of things in those kids really early on, and look to see how they develop over time. And what's interesting about this population is that you can look at dyslexia before dyslexia even emerges. You can look at it in 10-month-olds, in 2-year-olds, in 3-year-olds, in 4-year-olds, before they've started to learn to read. And you can then follow on and see who becomes dyslexic or who has low reading later on in the day, and then look back in the data set to see what their language was like earlier on in time. And what this literature has told us is that those people who go on to develop reading problems have language problems before the reading problem takes hold. And it isn't just in the phonological system, it's in the broader language system. And this is before reading's ever in the equation. These are 3-year-olds. So these are just some results from a meta-analysis by Maggie Snowling and Monica Melby-Lervag, which it's a big read. It's a hefty paper, but definitely one worth adding to the reading list. And what's shown in here are the kids who are from at-risk families. The one group, sorry, those colours aren't very distinctive, but the sort of darker, brighter one is the kids who go on to be dyslexic, and then the lighter one is the kids who go on not to be dyslexic. And then these are the effect sizes of the group differences relative to a non-dyslexic family sample, so a sort of control sample. So all of those, so 0 would be where the control children are behaving. So all of the children, regardless of the group they go on to be in, whether they have a dyslexia or not, are not doing brilliantly in terms of language comprehension or phonological awareness at the age of 3-ish. And we can see that's true for both the dyslexics and the non-dyslexics, and it's true for the phonological tasks, but it's also true for language beyond phonology. So there were these language problems there before reading happens or fails to happen. So for some kids then we should amend, some kids who have the label of dyslexia, we need to amend our simple view to think, okay, these children aren't just struggling with decoding, they're struggling with reading because of something that probably belongs in the linguistic comprehension box. So if we go back to the Denise being stuck in the Boston traffic jam example, it's not just a difficulty with identifying the words that these kids are at risk for, they'll be at risk for all of these other things as well, which tells us that their instruction perhaps needs to focus on all of those things as well, and not just be on the phonological core. So there's really some nice work coming out of the at-risk studies. So this is a slide from Charles Hume and colleagues' work. And here they talk about how language, oral language, underpins things that naturally fall in phonological processing, like rapid naming and phoneme awareness. And these lead to reading and reading comprehension. And they talk about these dual risks, these multiple risks. So we've got one risk, which is about language, and another risk, which is about the phonological core. So clearly then, what follows from this is that kids with this dyslexia profile are at risk for difficulties with reading comprehension that are ongoing difficulties with learning to read if they're not as well equipped to harness these morphological regularities, for example. And so therefore, our assessment and intervention needs to target all of these things, not just the decoding core. Was that 5 minutes, that one, Tiffany? 4 minutes now. Yeah, okay. So I just want to finish by not setting out any details of intervention studies, but just, I guess, to try and think through what it is we can do in this room collectively when we bring together complementary expertise in research and in educational practice. This sort of circle between theory and practice reminds us that this is very much a two-way street. It isn't just dissemination from one body to another body. It's continuous interactive links between us. And I think what good intervention needs, well, it needs a strong theoretical foundation. And my advisor, Charles Hume, when he talks about this, he said, if reading's broken, you fix reading. So fix something that's close to the problem and not too distal. And he also talks about how things should have face validity, that, what's the causal mechanism here? Is standing on one leg and balancing, is that really going to improve reading? It seems unlikely. Okay, so think about what's broken in reading, and that's where to aim intervention and fix it. And of course, evidence that's going to feed its way into education needs to be informed by evaluation, rigorous evaluation like randomized control trials. And this requires this partnership between research and practice. So building on what I've talked about today, then we've got this theory-practice loop. Well, the theory is telling us that reading will be compromised by weaknesses in the phonological domain, and for some children at least, difficulties in the oral domain beyond phonology, which sets up that these are the things that need to be improved and targeted by teaching and instruction. Doing that, it might not work when we actually run it in a randomized control trial. So the practice is telling us that the theory is wrong. The theory needs to change. So this loop needs to go round a little bit, and that's where the researchers need to learn from what's happening, meaningfully happening in a well-implemented, feasible way in our classrooms. If it doesn't work, then the theory needs fixing because it's clearly not working right. Something needs to be refined to make this loop works. When it does work, we then can think about the implications for policy, for having mandates about assessment, about intervention and instruction, about initial teacher training, SLP training, continuing professional development, which of course then would lead back to the practice. So this is what we can hope to achieve through organisations like this. There's some nice examples of this type of approach in the UK, and actually I've made my slides available, but they're now out of date, so I'll send on an updated version that has the actual slides I presented today. This is work from the UK led by Maggie Snowling and Charles Hume. Maggie also wrote a blog on my website talking about this approach to intervention and how intervening with both language and phonology can work together to bring about improvements. And then within the US context, I highly recommend this lovely paper by Suzanne Adloff and our very own Tiffany Hogan, which has just recently come out in some journal, which wasn't open access, but I believe it is open access now. Good. So conclusions then. Reading is complex. I think we all know that, but it's worth, taking a minute to really reflect on the complexities of what we do when we read, and therefore the challenge that it is for all children, but particularly for those children who are at risk. Thinking about the complexity, the simple view certainly has utility. I think having those two different arms to the simple view helps us understand some of the complexity. But we have to remember that within each of those bubbles, there's huge amounts of complexity. These are constructs, they're not processes. Dyslexia is complex. It often co-occurs with oral language beyond the phonological core. This has obvious implications for reading comprehension, but also for word reading itself. What does having a language problem, in addition to a phonological problem, tell us about orthographic learning, tell us about sensitivity to these morphological links? And this is a slide just to finish on, almost to finish on. I'm taking a lesson from Ken here. This is the last slide, not quite. But this is one of Maggie Snowling's slides, who actually does implementation and intervention work. I don't, but her recommendations, I asked her and she gave me this slide, were intervene, don't wait, ensure a strong foundation in language, offer a tiered approach to intervention and monitor response, provide assistive technology where appropriate, be aware of co-occurring features. The one I've emphasised in today's talk is language. We know there's a load of other things: attention, executive function, self-regulation, ADHD things, a whole sort of things. Offer support, guidance, and appropriate arrangements to people and their families. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about the sort of work that we're doing, we collectively, the cognitive psychology, the experimental work on learning to read and its implications for the classroom. We recently wrote a review paper that's available open access and there for everybody to download and have a read of. And just in closing, I'm going to leave you with 3 diagrams which hopefully summarise the take-home messages from today's talk. Thank you. Do you want to come here, Tiffany?
We have time for one question. Does anyone have the one question they want to ask? If you have a question, go to the mic, please.
I should say I'm here all day and I'm very happy to chat to people in the breaks, and I know Ken has already said that he's happy to do that too. So please don't be shy. It'd be lovely to say hello and hear your questions and comments. Yeah.
So I have a daughter who would fit into the D realm of your quadrant, where she is a fantastic decoder, a terrible sentence reader. She'll stop in the middle of a sentence and say, "What does that mean?" She's in college now, very, very slow. So her issue, I think, is slow processing and word retrieval. And I guess for me, the question would be, how do you work to, and I have poor retrieval issues too, so how would you work to fix poor retrieval and slow processing?
Yeah. Let's go back to that picture. Okay, so you're referring to this diagram here and the question about the quadrant D, and I think there's a couple of ways, at least a couple of ways, how people can find themselves in quadrant D. So the group of quadrant D children I've worked with most of all, and also in Tiffany's work, are kids who, unlike your daughter actually, they're kids who do read well, accurately and fluently. They don't have a processing bottleneck or a slow speed. They have a language difficulty, and their difficulties with comprehension that puts them in box D, by definition, is something that's in the linguistic comprehension box, rather than something that's in the decoding box or something that's a consequence of something that's in the decoding box. For those poor comprehenders, they're almost the mirror image of the classic dyslexia pattern. And we know there the sort of instruction that those children require is speech therapy, essentially. You know, lots and lots of vocabulary, work with morphology and grammar. I think there are some children who on a particular assessment might look as if they're in quadrant D, like the poor comprehenders, but arguably for a different reason, in that they are the kids who are, the spoken language knowledge is there, but sometimes it's slow to access, maybe because working memory sometimes people talk about, or processing speed. That's not an area I've ever particularly worked on, so I don't know if there's instructional recommendations there. Maybe others just in front of you might be able to comment, and people in the room. I would say, though, in my experience, and wouldn't be the case with your daughter who's a college student, but the kids who appear to be like that, they're actually the ones with the language problems. But obviously that doesn't go for every child, that's at a group level. So for me, the processing speed and the working memory problems in kids who can otherwise read tend to co-occur with low spoken language. Okay. Okay, I think that's something, but it doesn't mean it holds for every child. And for some children, there's always, this is a massive multidimensional space with lots of continuums interacting, and people can have their own little unique profile. So, yeah.